Welcome to the Predictable Revenue Podcast, where frontline sales leaders teach you how to build and scale an outbound sales team. Welcome back to the Predictable Revenue Podcast. I'm your host, Collin Stewart. Today, I'm joined by a guy who you might recognize just by if you're listening, you might not see his shirt, but I'd say he's Hawaiian shirted up everywhere I've seen him. He was the head of inside sales over at MuleSoft. You might have heard a ton of his content coming from there. I know I followed him for a while. He spent some time over at Salesforce, where I hear he caught the Aloha spirit. Before that, he was a special ops and Army Rangers sniper. So possibly the most badass podcast guest we've ever had. Welcome, Steven Broudy.
Thank you. I'd say I'm far from a badass, especially now that I'm wearing a pink Aloha shirt, but I appreciate the shout out, and I'm really excited because I feel like predictable revenue and the content you're putting out has really been personally extremely valuable for me. So I'm excited.
Thanks, man. And this is going to be a fun one because you've been a content creator in the space, along with, head of many sales teams, and somebody that I'd say that isn't just a pure content creator, has a pretty strong following yourself. And so I wanted to use the opportunity to thank you for coming on the show, and then get a feel for what you think the next sort of 5 to 10 years is going to look like in sales. And so in this episode, we're going to kind of zoom out and look into the future of, what does sales look like in Steven's mind? What does it look like today? And sort of what is that trajectory? Where's it going? And then I'm going to try and find some, I like to get tactical on the show. So I'm going to try and find some areas where we can just sort of dive deep and say, okay, well, based on what you're doing now, how do we go deep on this? And we've got a couple of really good ones around sort of, I don't want to spoil too much, but around some channels and around sort of internal stakeholders and things like that. So just with that said, I'm trying to think here. Before we jump in too deep, you're VP and head of sales over at Bevy Labs. Can you talk to me about your journey and how you got there? Because I think it's a really interesting one to share.
Yeah. So first and foremost, I grew up in San Francisco as sort of the poor kid who at one point went to a really, really good school. And I was the sort of charity case on a full ride scholarship. And I say that because it's actually relevant. It's a large part of the driving reason why I ended up in sales. So I had this sort of epiphany, or a moment, if you want to call it, when I was 12 years old. I was over at my best friend's house, who, to give you context, this is 6th grade. This kid's parents literally had their last name on a lecture hall at Cal Berkeley. That gives you any sort of idea of the level of wealth we're dealing with. Mm-hmm. And I remember, as his nanny was loading me into her car and I was looking back at his mansion as I was about to go get a ride to the bus stop to take 2 Muni buses home. I remember thinking, man, pardon my French, but F this, like, I do not want to die poor. And, that was the start of my journey into sales. I didn't know it at the time. I had a very non-traditional route. On the one hand, I did this sort of dial for dollars sales thing that you do in college when you're dialing down on alumni in the midst of an impending recession and asking them for money, which is always a lot of fun. And I actually really enjoyed it. But when I was in college, I accidentally started doing Army ROTC. And I really mean that. I thought I was taking like a 5 a.m. workout class, and it was actually an Army ROTC class. And this was in the midst of 2 wars, one with Iraq and one with Afghanistan, both of which I actually thought were on the verge of ending. So I was sort of eager to experience what that sort of extreme of the human existence was like. And while I was doing that, I actually ended up learning about Army Special Operations, where as an officer, you have to be in the Army for 4 years to try out. And as an enlisted guy or gal now, you really actually can get a contract to go and do that. So long story short, I ended up actually declining my commission as an officer, which did not go over well, especially because the first person I had to tell was like a colonel. But they eventually let me have 14 days to pay back all the money they had given me to pay my way through college. And I ended up enlisting with a contract that let me actually try out for an Army Special Operations unit. And I ended up doing that for just shy of 6 years. So I went to Iraq twice, Afghanistan 3 times. And honestly, it was one of the best experiences of my life. But I anchor you in that original story because I was sort of at this place where I had to figure out, like, is this going to be the rest of my life? Like, I love my work. I'm passionate about it. I feel like I'm good at it. I feel like I'm continuing to learn and to grow, on the one hand, but on the other hand, I literally was scrapping by to pay rent because I didn't want to live in Tacoma, Washington, and chose to live in Seattle instead, so I could actually have some separation in my life. And I realized, like, I sort of committed to not dying poor, and no matter what, no matter how successful I am in this role, that's sort of the path I found myself on. So, being a kid from city of San Francisco, I came back and I sort of just naturally fell into sales. It's funny. Salesforce originally told me when I came back that I did not have enough sales experience to qualify as an SDR. And I ended up finding instead a tech company that my boss at the time, who was the CMO, basically said, look, I'll take a chance on you. We've sort of hired and fired this team a few times over. And if you can find some success, you can actually go ahead and actually build this team out. And we were starting to find a lot of success, and I was able to do that. And we were acquired by Cornerstone On Demand. So when that happened, it was sort of fortuitous, but one of my college roommates happened to be the EA to the CEO of MuleSoft. And I knew nothing about MuleSoft. And I was actually on the verge of taking like a SDR leadership role at Salesforce, which is kind of cool. It was really validating that they were willing to now take that sort of chance on me. And she said, look, I think we're hiring for like a pretty similar role. You should just go and try out, like, interview here. And when I interviewed there, like, what struck me was the density of talent was unbelievable. And I knew, like, this is the kind of talent where I had been so afraid leaving special operations, where you have this incredibly rigorous assessment and selection process. I'd been so afraid that I would never work with that quality or that caliber or that density of talent ever again. And I felt really confident that at MuleSoft, that was going to be the case. And it was. So we went through, some really great growth. We grew the team something like 7 people to 67 people on the SDR inside sales side, and ended up going through an IPO and eventually the acquisition by Salesforce. And I had been tasked to actually stand up a business operations function and run that. And actually the first sort of project I took on was talent effectiveness. Like, how do we turn our talent team, which is essentially a sales team, into more of an inside sales type of operating organization? And, in the midst of that, the talent team ended up getting integrated into Salesforce. So I was then tasked with some of the integration work. And, once that was complete, I started working on the sort of sales effectiveness initiative that we had, which was really exciting. The way I ended up at Bevy is really interesting. So on the one hand, I was doing this business operations function, and one of the things that we were tasked with is like a systems reconciliation exercise. And there was surprisingly few systems that we were both using, both Salesforce and MuleSoft. And one of them was actually Bevy. And I found out about Bevy, and then coincidentally, someone who used to work at Salesforce, who had actually been like the first GM of the marketing cloud and had actually driven the exact target acquisition, reached out to me and said, hey, this company is having like really sort of unreasonably, like an unreasonable amount of success. And they're doing it without essentially having any sort of sales function to speak of. I think you should like just meet the CEO, see if maybe you can help them out. And I started advising them and realized, like, this is too much of an amazing opportunity to pass up. And that's how I've landed at Bevy. And it's been an amazing experience ever since.
Man, that's such a cool journey. And it's so great when you can land at a company who you've used their tool. You've got some validation of, hey, it's not just, hey, come in and help me sell this old software tool that nobody wants to buy. Because I think when you're looking at a new job, that's always one of the biggest things is like, am I attaching myself to sort of a beater or a rocket ship?
Yeah. Or a cruise ship. And I felt like Salesforce is an amazing company, but going from being a sort of hypergrowth startup to a hypergrowth big tech company, it feels like felt really jolting for me. And I am learning so much working at a company in this evolution. And I've sort of had to dispel with a lot of my preconceived notions about what the right sort of operating rhythm is. And truthfully, that's been an amazing learning experience in and of itself.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the reasons why I felt like the experience from sort of MuleSoft to Salesforce to Bevy was super relevant to the conversation is we're talking about what's happening in the next 10 years. And from what I know about what they were doing, what Bevy was doing for MuleSoft, that was your number one lead source. Mm-hmm. Right? And I think if I look at some of the trends that are happening, just if you think about just from the raw numbers, right? If you were to measure, and I'm sure there's only a few companies that actually have even a reasonable guess at this, but I'm sure that those, SalesLoft and Outreach and Salesforce could probably have a reasonable guess. But if you look at the total number of SDRs that exist in the world today, if you look at the total number of emails and the total number of calls that those SDRs are making, it's probably growing at an exponential rate. Mm-hmm. And it's probably, I'd say, of all three of those, the email has probably grown the most. Right? If I look at, 10 years ago when Predictable Revenue was just coming out or was a new book, you could send an email and get a, 15, 25% response rate to C-level executives. No problem. Right? If you use that same email template today, I bet you get 50 emails out of the gate before like 6 people have flagged you as spam. Mm-hmm. And so there's a dramatic difference between the world 10 years ago and the world we live in today. And I think anytime you find a channel that can bring and put your prospects in front of your salespeople, I'm keen to learn a little bit more. So can you talk to me about talk to me about that lead source and how you guys got into realizing that, hey, getting our prospects physically in front of us could be a game changer? Yeah.
So I think the easiest way to explain why I was so, like, when I actually understood what Bevy was doing, I was so excited to land there. And that's that if you look at how you buy as a consumer, that same shift is happening in B2B buying. So I call it like the Amazonification of how you buy. If you're anything like me, the way I buy, it's essentially 3 things. I either go online on Amazon because they deliver to my door and I look at the exact thing that I want. I find the version of it that has the highest number of reputable reviews, and I go and I procure that. The second way I buy is I say, hey, Collin, that's an awesome Hawaiian shirt. Where did you get it? And you go and you tell me, and I go and I buy it. And the third thing I do is I say, man, Collin, like, you are the god of Hawaiian shirts. Where should I be buying? And I go and I listen to what you have to say. And really at the core of that is this shift away from actually engaging with salespeople towards using other channels that you actually trust. Because at the core of the shift in buying is not just the habituation of consumer behavior because of like the digital e-commerce channels through which we now tend to buy, but the erosion of trust in the sales sort of profession.
Where do you think that, what's contributed to that erosion?
I think, to your point, there's a lot of readily available information on how to quote unquote sell effectively. I think there is a lack of empathy from salespeople and a lack of desire to actually understand what customers care about and align a solution to that, or to go after these really broad markets and try and move upstream really rapidly, or to try and sell a platform, because that's what VCs want you to eventually do. And you end up solving a lot of problems pretty terribly. And on top of that, there's been this massive proliferation of SaaS, and there's a lot lower barriers to entry to actually create new products. So there's a ton of noise and a lack of differentiation. I think the other thing is, like, sellers really struggle to deliver value to customers. I think, like, if you go and read one piece of Gartner research, there's this research they put out on the idea of elevating the value of sales interactions. And there's this statistic in there where of all the sales leaders they poll, 94% agree that sellers struggle to deliver value to customers. And again, I go back to the idea that if it wasn't for predictable revenue and some of those email templates that you sort of referenced originally, I probably would have had zero success in my first SaaS sales role. Now, to your point, like if I use that same template all over again in a channel that's now a lot more inundated, or if I tried to cold call people when it's really easy for Apple or Google to flag, unknown numbers or, root them out as potential robocalls, well, I'm probably going to be a lot more successful. So you really have to evolve to match the sort of state of B2B buying behavior if you're going to be successful in any sales role.
I couldn't agree more. And I think in this context, we're both going to be correct and incorrect from my experience. And I get two different campaigns that two different SDRs at Predictable Revenue here have ran personally. Mm-hmm. And one was to more of a SaaS. It was like SaaS companies, sort of 1 to 10 million. And that those campaigns produced, the phone that was like pickup rates were like 0%, like 0 point something percent. Your email reply rates, unless you're, getting into the personalization and you're super relevant, would have been super low, or were super low if you tried a more mass approach. If you tried a very personalized, targeted, integrated with social, and you're dropping some voicemails, we saw a pretty reasonable pickup. On the flip side, targeting, we had one where we targeted sort of industrial manufacturers. It had the exact opposite, right? But you're targeting an older in a different industry. Nothing else worked except for just picking up the phones, and we were getting 30 to 40% pickup rates. And so in that case, why bother going through all that work if you can just make 60 dials and have 5 conversations or 10 conversations with people, because the pickup rates are so good. And so I feel like that is eventually going to evolve, right? Those are obviously, we're talking about the sort of laggards and if we're talking technology lifecycle adoption or tech lifecycle, anyway, the curve, that's what it was. That was the C. I was like, I know it's elk. I'm like, where's the C?
If we're crossing the chasm eventually,
I just said cycle. And, and so I think that is slowly going to go away. But I think if we look at today, a lot of this is going to hinge on who we're selling to. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
I agree. I think the one thing that's constant, and again, I go back to the Gartner data on this, is what you can focus on to make sure you're successful. And by the way, I think you're completely correct. The channel that's going to be most successful depends on your buyer. Trying to cold call CIOs or get them, over email is really difficult. Getting them to an executive dinner, on the other hand, is probably a lot more successful, or getting sort of, referrals through their network probably is going to be a lot more successful. On the flip side at Bevy, when we're talking to, heads of marketing and actually heads of community, it's interesting because the pain that we're focused on solving is so specific and so acute and so strongly felt with specific individuals within an organization. It's like, one, they're probably inundated a lot less, but on the other hand, I think it goes beyond just like the specificity of the level of maturation of that industry, which I think, to your point, is a big piece of like those reply rates, but it's actually the specificity of the pain to which you speak that really dictates the level of responsiveness as well. So I think it's the sort of amalgamation of those two factors. I think what is more consistent though is that people in a B2B buying process tend to spend their time pretty consistently. And if you can align the specific actions you're taking to drive success to the sort of specific slices of the pie, in which, like, if you sort of imagine a pie graph, if you can align specific activities and actions to match where buyers are spending their time and really sort of invest accordingly, you can find a ton of success.
100%. And I totally agree with your with your sort of your take on things, that it's 100% and almost primarily that I'd call that product market fit. If you have excellent product market fit, then you're going to have a much easier time with everything. That's the sort of like binary switch. It's like, is this going to be easy? Is this going to be really hard? And somebody who's helped a couple hundred companies build outbound sales programs. Like, we see that. They're like, well, why aren't we hitting benchmarks? It's like, well, sometimes, if you're in a pretty commoditized industry, your product isn't that innovative, you're going to have a lot harder time. And then I would say, and agree with you on the sort of, it's on the bell curve. And if you're selling into SaaS, you're selling into the leading edge, which means, if you want to land those big deals with those sexy logos, you really have to step up your game. And so I'm going to flip it back to you and say, well, what does that look like now? And what's that going to look like in the future?
Yeah. So again, I'll reference that same sort of body of research, and essentially here is the time a buyer spends broken down across a sort of sales process. So they spend 27% of their time researching online. They spend 22% of their time meeting with the buying group. They spend 18% of their time meeting with people in real life, doing sort of, call it independent offline research. And then they spend 17% of their time, which is actually the smallest slice of the pie, meeting with potential vendors. And I think you need to really focus on those as the individual channels where, like, what are the prescriptive actions we're going to take in order to be effective across that sort of entire buying process? And, I'm happy to dive into my sort of perspective on how you can do that well.
Yeah, I'd love to know, because I know we're going to talk a little bit about channels. We're going to talk about in person. Seeing as that's sort of how you got here, why don't you tell us how you see events and how you see sort of bringing your buyers into like physical contact with your sales team?
Yeah. So again, first and foremost, like, why is that critically important? Again, I go back to the idea of trust. Like, let's be completely honest. As an institution and as an industry, like, the lack of trust in salespeople is ever present and probably only growing. And with that in mind, like, you need to ask yourself, like, who do people actually trust, right? And who do people actually trust in light of the fact that it's easier to find their contact information? It's easier for people to try and reach out to you. People are getting better and more effective thanks to, like, the predictable revenues of the world at actually crafting really good messaging. And the answer is they trust your customers, and they trust the people within their specific networks. And so that is, like, the power of in person, is that people spend more time meeting with your customers as those buyers are evaluating whether or not they want to, actually end up procuring your software. They spend more time meeting with them than they do meeting with your salespeople. So how do you go from creating or having like an organic sort of ecosystem in which that's happening to actually prescriptively creating opportunities for people to connect? And that's like the Bevy value proposition in its essence. And how do you do that at scale? Because it's, the traditional approach has been, if you want to build or scale, in-person events or community, you really need to do one of three things. You need to work harder. You probably need to lose a little bit of sleep, or you need to hire more people so that you have more field marketers or marketers to go and create these events independently and go and moderate them and curate them and ensure that they're on brand. And if you think about, like, if McDonald's had tried to scale by having a member of corporate HQ go and start every single McDonald's franchise, they've never found any, like nearly the kind of success they have now. Like, I love In-N-Out. I was a level 4 fry technician in high school. I think that In-N-Out, which is not a franchise, has had a ton of success. But if you look at how many states they're in, there's a reason they haven't been able to grow. Now, they've done a good job at maintaining the sort of quality and integrity of the brand, but whether you like McDonald's or not, what you get when you go to McDonald's is a consistent branded experience. And they've been able to really drive this sort of franchise model. And where I think the best in industry SaaS companies have gone. The Salesforces, the Atlassians, the Slacks of the world. Like Salesforce, by the way, just grew to 1,000 Trailblazer groups meeting in person this year. That's astounding. And they're 13 years into their growth. If you look at what they do, they have a franchised sort of federated model where they're empowering their community to scale itself. So a team at the Trailblazer team, I don't know, it's something like 6, 7 people have been able to drive massive scale where they're probably tracking to put on something like 7,500 in-person events this year. And I damn well guarantee you those 7 or 12 or however many people on their team are not going and attending every single one of them. And that is the way you drive massive scale and recognize the fact that while you need to go and own that offline channel because people are spending more time there than they are with your customers, you can actually do it in a way that's sustainable and actually really revenue efficient. Because I think revenue efficiency is going to be one of those metrics that you continue to see rising to a level of eminence in, boardroom type discussions, especially if the economy starts contracting and, we don't really continue to just push down on the gas and hire like hell every time someone raises a big round.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're in a pretty large, or at least at the time of recording the podcast, one of the longest running, I think the longest standing bull market in US economic history. And I think if you look every quarter, people are buying more software than they have in history. It's like, well, if that continues, great. But and I think if I've learned anything is that every market, every sort of industry has ups and downs. And we've been a real big up for a very long time where the whole idea has been spend and grow and spend to acquire customers. Mm-hmm. And if that changes and all of a sudden people need to focus on, we can't spend 600 or 6 figures on an SDR. That doesn't make sense on an SDR that's trying to close, 5-figure deals. Your revenue efficiency is pretty low on that one. I think if anybody's followed David Skocks, he does this SaaS metrics report every year. And I've been watching him from, I think since 2013 or 2014 when he first started doing it. And it started off, and I remember vividly, it was, because I don't come from a venture backed sort of, I came from sales and then I started my own thing. And we've been bootstrapped 7 years. And I remember when I first read that report, the metric that blew me away was the average company in the Valley that's, fundraised and done a series A and B, was spending 92 cents to acquire $1 of ACV. And that number's gone from 92 cents to, I think it's somewhere above $1.07 right now. Mm-hmm. And so it was 2 years ago, it tipped across the over the $1 mark. So if you're signing $10,000 deals in year one, you're spending $10,000 to acquire that. And then your cash to cash conversion is brutal because you spend that upfront and probably 3 to 6 months upfront. And then you take a year to get paid back. And I love SaaS as a business model, but that just seems, that's a hard business model to, to continue funding. And so if revenue efficiency starts becoming this thing that everybody's talking about, what does that look like? How are we gonna, how do salespeople adapt, and where do we still fit in that model?
Yeah. And you touch on a really interesting piece with the sort of CAC and payback period metrics there. And that's that, even if you're really successful at acquiring customers at a premium and you grow, the SaaS model is inherently sort of dependent on people renewing and net dollar retention. And if you explode in terms of the volume of growth you drive, you still have to service those people. So then you have to start how do you drive service at scale? I think that's where, traditionally companies have looked at things like online forums to do ticket deflection. I think it does an amazing job, but customer success extends beyond support, right? It extends the idea that people are actually successful in implementing the projects that drive the results, that drive the tangible impact, that drive the return on investment that they're looking to make every time they're procuring software. And, getting your customers connected so that they can actually share their experience and their journey is just another amazing way to do that. And again, I go back to like revenue efficiency. Like there's other things that are happening in the Valley that are, I look at them as both really good and really bad. Like Salesforce, again, like here's another way they've been just wildly successful. Dreamforce is, you know, if I trusted having weirdos walking around my house, I'd rent out my house in San Francisco every single time that Dreamforce came into town, because I'd probably be able to pay the rent for, you know, the entire year, because it is the event in SaaS. And what they realized is like they can put on these massive events. They cost a ton of money, but they drive a ton of pipeline. But the problem is like when you're an early stage or medium sort of growth SaaS company and you go and you do something like that, well, you might activate and get everyone really engaged, but then what do you do? Like, where do they go after that? Mm-hmm. And that was sort of the catalyst for the birth of the Trailblazer groups, is like having a channel to actually channel them into, and actually taking people from sort of just user groups to like sort of role-centric groups where they could actually learn from like-minded practitioners, and those practitioner groups drive a ton of substantive value. Where, you know, Erica Cool, who's the head of community or head of the Trailblazer community, got on stage at SaaStr and said something to the effect of, you know, there's a 4 times greater customer retention rate for people who are actually engaged in community. So again, I look at like, you know, that's a really, really interesting and effective way to scale success. And I think that's part of why I was just so energized to make the leap over to Bevy.
And that's amazing that Salesforce, because you're totally right. Dreamforce is one giant event where nearly 200,000 people come to town. And it's just like every other conference on steroids, right? Like it's SaaStr times 20, which is crazy to think about. SaaStr is a big show, and, you know, in the industry, but something to be, you know, 20 times bigger is just bonkers. You've got this, like, would you rather, as a brand, would you rather have this one big notable impression versus, you know, that's going to come and go and people are going to spend a bunch of money and then sort of wonder, was this a good investment for me? Or would you rather have a lighter touch community where there's this regular engagement, right? And I think growing up in the sort of SaaS industry for the last 7 years, the thing that comes back to my mind is sort of the toothbrush test. And it's a measure of, do you have product market fit? And I can't remember who said it. It was probably Paul Graham or somebody like that. And it was basically, do your customers use your products twice a day? And if they do, you'll be successful. And if they don't, then you have work to do. And I don't think with Trailblazer, we're not quite getting closer to the toothbrush test, but it brings us one step closer from, you know, the engagements that you could have once a year to monthly, weekly. Like what do these events look like with these Trailblazers? Are they monthly events? Are they?
Yeah. I think it varies by organization. And I think you really bring up a really good point about the toothbrush test. You know, I was talking to Julie, who runs the Marketo user groups, and the Marketo user groups are another sort of gold standard of community and in-person events. And, you know, people literally have staked their career on Marketo as a marketing automation system, to the point where she was explaining to me, like, they recently had a story where someone was applying for a job and they were meeting with the hiring manager in the final round, and the hiring manager was really keen to hire this person. And that hire asked, like, do you guys use Marketo? Because if not, I'm not going to take the role. Or if you won't let me bring it on board, I'm not going to take the job. And I look at all the people in San Francisco. I don't know if it's like this up in Canada, but I've got all these people walking around rocking Trailblazer hoodies who've literally sort of staked their career on being a part of the Salesforce community. And here's the thing, like, and, you know, I'm loath to say this, but I don't know if Salesforce is the best CRM, right? I don't know if Zendesk's sales CRM, Dynamics, HubSpot's got a better sales CRM. But as an example, like, I look at all those other companies, and what I do know is, like, I feel like Salesforce is a hell of a lot more present, and there's a lot more people who have a specific skill set who work in sales operations roles, and that naturally dictates that those individuals are going who, especially members of the community who are really engaged and have a ton of affinity for the brand, are going to go and bring that sort of brand or that CRM to whatever company they go to. And I think like that's true stickiness. Like that's a competitive moat. Like your customers are your competitive moat. And again, I go back to like what's changing. No one trusts your salespeople. I mean, you should absolutely equip them to drive tangible impact and really drive like a value-driven, outcome-based sort of sale. But there's only so much you can do to create trust. And inherently, even if you're great at that, your prospects probably still trust your customers more. So I think it's really, really interesting. It's almost this reversion to, relationships mattering a hell of a lot more. The problem is like, we don't tend to have the time or the sort of networks as, this digital generation to go and find and develop those relationships on our own. So if companies can create communities where people can coalesce and create inorganic opportunities for people to connect that feel seemingly organic, like that's a real game changer.
You're totally right, because the most specialized, like people are going to want the most specialized people, and in learning something like Marketo, Eloqua, Pardot, Salesforce, even like HubSpot, any of those tools, it takes time and sort of mastery over how do I get. You need to be able to design a process, right? And you need to be able to understand, okay, what is all the content that goes into this process? And then you need to know how to implement it in a certain way. And people want to hire people that have been there and done that. They don't want to hire somebody who's like, whatever you've got, I can figure it out. And so you want to hire somebody because they've had this experience. And so when you're hiring for, hey, they can bring these systems, you're basically hiring the tool set that they like the most and that's best serving to them. And it's basically whoever can onboard the most people into their communities, because it's not just the help docs. I don't know how many people use Salesforce, but I can guarantee that most of them didn't learn Salesforce by going into the like help section of Salesforce. You learned it by figuring it out. You learned it by sitting down with an AE, with your manager, with somebody in the community. You learned it by going to one of these meetups. It's almost coming down to a point where the people, the companies that are going to win these markets, it feels like it's almost community driven. It's not a race to have the most SDRs. It's not a race to book the most meetings. It's a race to getting like the strongest foothold in each of those communities, because that's going to be that sort of virtuous cycle where you can push down and teach them and help all these people build their careers on top of your product. And in return, when they change jobs, they're going to bring in your product.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so is that sort of the direction that I kind of sum that up nicely? Is that where you see things going?
I mean, if you want to sell Bevy, I'd be more than happy to hire you. I think yes, to answer your question, like, absolutely. That's the direction I see it going. The other thing is like with this trend of this continued erosion of trust in sales, you have to think about like, how do you impact, or sort of how do you recognize that and take action at to address that reality in the other channels, like whether that's, people spending a ton of time doing independent research online. Like, how do you recognize the fact that people don't trust you and actually develop trust? Like, what are the specific strategies there? What are the specific strategies when people are meeting with a buying group to develop trust? And what are the specific strategies that you need to take on when people are meeting with your salespeople? Like, what are the core fundamental sort of actions that you need to make sure you're nailing to ensure you're developing trust across all those channels? Because again, your customers inherently are trustworthy. So go double down on connecting them face to face and get them in front of your prospects, and it'll create a virtuous cycle, but make sure you're still not leaving those other channels in the dark. So, we can dig into that if it's valuable to spend some time there.
For sure. I had so many questions for you, and we got about 6 minutes left. So why don't we go into, we can drop all the other stuff at the end, but let's just talk a little bit about internal stakeholders and how we can sort of leverage, do you leverage these communities in a world where your average buyer wants to spend less and less time with the salespeople, how do you make sure that you're still able to help them move the conversation forward internally?
Yeah. So I think like one of the ways people in the past traditionally have helped individuals bring a business case to bear is they've driven references. And I think you literally have like reference systems now that exist within your CRM. And I'm not saying you should or shouldn't use those, but I think they're a function of the idea that we're now creating reference fatigue, and that references still feel staged. There's some pretty good data about the fact that like people get that you're being put on a reference call because you don't, or when someone is taking a reference call, they're probably taking a reference call with one of your customers who's been coached. I think when you're thinking about meeting with the internal buying group, the way you develop trust is really like, first and foremost, you've got to like verify that you're guiding them through a buying process, because as the complexity of buying gets harder, you need to actually equip them and teach them how to buy. So there's a few ways you can do that. And by the way, these should all be like verifiable actions within your CRM. So, the big one is like, how do you co-craft a business case? Everyone talks about how important it is to meet with executives, but how do you position your internal stakeholders at your at prospective companies as champions in front of their bosses? And one of the best ways to do that is co-crafting a business case. And if you're initially doing something like an upfront value assessment, or helping them quantify the tangible ROI and understand the sort of commercial teaching lessons that their boss needs to understand to feel confident that this approach is right, you're going to have a lot more success in a sale. There's other ways you can go about approaching that, but I think it's really, really critical to hold your champion's hand, navigate them through the process, and co-craft that business case so that you're literally sitting there and they're sort of reading back to their boss what you would have read to their boss as well. And also, again, you're positioning them as a hero. And as you position them as a hero, they're going to feel an even sort of deeper affinity for your brand, and they're going to be more likely to want to work with you.
Amazing. And we only got a couple minutes left, but I'd love if you could just give me some insight into when you co-craft a business case with a customer. What do you cover in there? Is it, because I've done some of these before, and I've seen some of these before, and they sort of range from, you can tell that AE threw it together versus you can tell that marketing was like, hey, copy and paste this stuff. So what do yours look like? What is the balance of sort of templated content versus something that you and that you're empowering your AEs or your closing team to build?
Yeah, I think the single most important piece I'll say is, I'm all about driving reuse in any sales process, but it needs to be specific and really speak to the specific tangible outcomes that a customer is trying to drive. Now, over time, as you build a portfolio of customers, like you'll have the same sort of use cases surfacing over and over again, and you can recycle sort of snippets of that content. But I think what a business case really needs to focus on is like, what's the outcome we're trying to drive? How do we tangibly quantify that? And then like, how does not the platform, but like the platform, the IP, and the methodology that you're driving actually uniquely position you as the only viable solution? And if it's like a pure platform-led presentation, I don't think you're going to win. I actually think, I'm of the mind that the platform should almost take a back seat, because you should have secured a technical win, at this sort of stage. And really what you're trying to convey is that like you, customer or prospective customer, should have confidence that we understand what matters to you, and that we are uniquely positioned based on our experience working with people like you, that we can make you wildly successful. And we're going to be held mutually accountable to actually ensuring that success is happening. And we have a plan to make that happen. And we've used this plan before, and it's going to be tailored to you, but we have a track record of success addressing the specific pain that you care about that makes the status quo untenable. And I know that sounds a little like high level, but essentially if you distill it down, you need to take like a prospect's top 3 priorities, put them front and center as like, that's the agenda. Like, here's your 3 most pressing pain points and priorities. They're tied to a specific initiative that you actually have. There's quantifiable value that addressing that pain will solve. And our IP, experience, methodology, and platform are the only one that can actually check all three of those boxes and make you wildly successful.
Amazing, Steven. We are right at the top of the hour mark, so I want to let you go. I want to thank you so much for your time. If anybody's is saying, damn, I love this guy's Hawaiian shirts, or shit, Bevy sounds really cool, what's the best way they can get in touch with you?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter. It's at Steven with a V for very annoying. And my last name is spelled Broudy. You can blame Ellis Island for not creating a phonetic spelling when my ancestors migrated over here. Bravo, Romeo, Oscar, Uniform, Delta, Yankee. More importantly, Bevy is at bevylabs.com, BEVY labs, Lima Alpha Bravo Sierra.com.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, Steven. This has been great. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Collin. Really appreciate the opportunity to connect.
Right on. Thanks everybody for listening.
See you
next week.